Now, the gross domestic product grew by 5.01% on a year-on-year basis in real terms in the second quarter of this year. Now, this marks the third consecutive quarter of growth following the negative growth rates recorded in the second and third quarters of last year. Now, the Q2 2021 growth rate was higher than the minus 6.10% growth rate recorded in the second quarter of last year and 0.51% recorded in the first quarter of this year, indicating the return of business and economic activities near levels seen prior to the nationwide implementation of COVID-19 related restrictions. The steady recovery observed since the end of 2020, with the gradual return of commercial activities as well as local and international travel, accounts for the significant increase in the growth performance relative to the second quarter of last year, when nationwide restrictions took effect. Year to date, real GDP grew 2.7% this year, compared to minus 2.18% for the first half of this year. Nevertheless, quarter-on-quarter real GDP grew at minus 0.79% in the second quarter of this year compared to the first quarter, reflecting slightly slower economic activity than the preceding quarter due to largely seasonality. Well, joining me now live in our Lagos studio to discuss this and much more, I have economist Adeola Ojo. Good to have you on the breakfast show this morning.
Good morning.
Now, this news comes with mixed sentiment. It's cheering news on paper, and then because we are looking at an improvement of 0.5% in the first quarter of this year and now 5.01%, but to make a clear understanding of this is comparing last year, the second quarter of last year versus this year's quarter.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, the average man on the streets does not understand these terminologies or these reports we've had so far. It makes no economic sense for most of them, that we don't see the economy recovering in any sense of it, but yes, we're having this sort of results. Do you think this sort of report is enough to win the confidence of Nigerians, to temper the sentiments we have on ground and also see that we have a better outlook as a nation?
Basically, I want to commend the federal government of Nigeria and the necessary people who have actually come up with these results. I want to commend them. It's a good job they have done. I also want us to note this, that this period, like has been said by other economists, is the base period we are looking at was at the lowest ebb, minus 6-something% last year. And we are comparing our current performance with what happened at the lowest period of our GDP, even within this administration. So, but vis-a-vis, just like an example of, I was able to make 10 naira last year, and this year I was able to make 12 naira. And now I'm comparing my performance of 12 naira to what happened last year. Maybe, for example, 12 naira minus 10 naira gives me 2 naira. By the time I now divide it by the base year, which is 10 naira, eventually I'm going to have like 0.2. Multiplied by 100 will give me something like 20%. And I say, oh, my economy has grown 20% within this period. Just in normal balance. I'm not saying that is the way this one was fully calculated, because we have actually calculated for inflation and other things in it. So basically, I want to say that they have done a good job, and the result we have here is good, it's nice, it's beautiful, it's good for us to even look at and plan. But at the end, at the lower rung of it, I will say the people have not felt anything. The economy has not in any way shown signs of recovery or signs of growth. And I think the necessary fiscal authority and the, should be able to work on this to make sure this thing pans down to the lowest rung.
But these sentiments the people have is not out of space. We're looking at inflation at double digits. We're looking at unemployment rate skyrocketing. We're looking at the naira highly depreciate.
Sure.
We are having forex scarcity as part of the issues we are lingering with.
Sure.
We are still a monopolistic economy dealing with oil, and even looking at the performance of the oil sector to the contribution of the GDP, it still remains at a poor level. The non-oil sector, which contributes well over 90% of our GDP, still is not having an aggressive investment volume. Infrastructure development is not at the peak we want to see. So do you think these sentiments are enough to counter the reports we've had?
Basically, there are sentiments that are in place, but I would say it is not enough to counter, because what they have calculated here are aggregate of our consumption, the investment, government expenditure, and our import and export. It was a calculation. But like as I've said earlier, the baseline of where we calculated it from is what is actually giving us this figure that we are having as 5%, because the baseline was lower than 0. You get me, sir? The baseline was lower than 0. Had it been that
negative
6 point something. So by the time you look at that base compared to now, you say, oh, you are doing well. But compare it to a period when there was a growth, maybe to 2019, you will see that we have not done anything. Even by the time they calculated it against the first quarter, you could see that we actually came to negative.
Okay, now let's talk about the efforts by government to ensure that we see the economy also gradually stabilize. What are the steps or the areas you think they have to consecutively also or continue to apply more pressure or investment within the policy framework we've had so far to ensure that we still have this continuous consecutive growth in terms of the GDP performance?
Looking at the performance of the GDP,
I'd like you to focus this on, especially on the non-oil sector, looking at manufacturing, transportation, investment in ICT, and a whole lot more.
That's what I actually want to say, because here I want to look at it from both angles, non-oil and the oil sector. Yes, as of now, the best performance have been in the non-oil, and it has given us about 92% of the performance we have within the GDP. Whereas with the main cash cow that we have, which is the crude oil and petroleum sector, the oil sector actually has given us less than 8%. You understand, sir? So basically, I will say, had it been that the non-oil sector as is growing, the oil sector growth also contribution is also growing, then the growth will have been much more than this. So I would say the federal government and the fiscal authority should work more on that aspect of our oil sector. Then much more, because also by the time you look at each of the contributions of the sectors under the different sector that was mentioned in ICT, we saw that it went down from the previous section.
Exactly.
Q2 last year,
even the
it was 70-something%. Later, 14%. Now we are talking about 5.5% growth. It's going down. So we should work on that aspect, because if it's your largest contributor, then you need to inflate it. You need to work on it so that it can grow more. Then agricultural sector is also going down from 23 down to 22. Down, it went down by 1%. So it should also be considered. That is, our federal government should give consideration to these areas, because these are things that inflate your economy, that grows the economy. And if it should go down, it has a resultant effect upon the entirety of the economy. Apart from working on, then in the manufacturing sector also, there was growth, but the growth was a reduced growth. So we should also work. So basically, from what I have seen and from what the result has given us, yeah, there are some level of growth, but the growths were reduced growth, not the growth that we actually projected or we wanted.
Marginal growths they are. Yeah. But at this point in time now, let's play pundits looking at the third quarter of the year. We're already inching towards the end of the year. The first half-year report has come. We've seen quoted companies also release their results. What do you think would also play out by the third quarter of the year? Do you think we'll likely sustain this positive trajectory? That's what so many analysts are saying, from 0.51% to now 5.1%. Do you think we're still going to sustain that high tempo? Yeah, because of looking at the base too of third quarter last year, 3.62%, minus 3.62% was the performance last period, and that was one of the reasons why we went into recession. So if we are also going to calculate, if we are going to have some level of growth also within this period, and we are going to calculate it against the base year next quarter, we are still going to have a level of growth. So what I only want us to do is we should give it more push. Like I said, give non-oil sector more push. Then all other areas of a sector that we have considered that are not growing the way they should grow, we should also give them a push. So that by this time next quarter, when we are looking at what the performance, we can say, oh, we are getting there. And now let's also talk about this noise we have from the populace, where they say the figures we've had so far do not necessarily translate to the market sentiment or how the nation is really faring. Do you think we can silence this noise at all? Because it's an evident distraction. In as much as government attempts to put in policies and give its best foot, we still have the reality on ground that the impact is not as evident. So that is why we have this noise. Do you think at any point in time we'll likely silence this noise? Yeah, we will silence this noise by our performance, and by the time they begin to see the effect of another improved performance by the third quarter would also have the same reaction. Of course, because we must see it on the welfare of people. We must see it on the life of, because, for example, one of the basic things or ingredients of this GDP is your consumption. If your consumption increases, that means your purchasing power
has increased. So if if eventually it's affected, it's going to affect your consumption. So if it's maybe I'm sorry if it's only government expenditure that is contributing to this growth, then eventually one way or the other we may not see it until it pays down to the people. So we must work on each of the elements of GDP: consumption, investment, government expenditure, export, that is net export. We must work on all of them, because at the end, economics want to make sure that the welfare of people is prioritized, and that nobody is worse off while everybody is better off. So in one way or the other, this government should work in such a way that the welfare of the people is made paramount. We work towards getting them, I don't know how I'm going to put it, but making them better than they are. And eventually, if by this time next quarter, if we are going to come up with a level of growth and our purchasing power has also increased, then we can also say, oh, it is good. But if we are not able to see it, we will still continue to shout.
Thank you very much for your time on the Breakfast Show this morning. Adeola Ojo, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and the timeline for the current administration is also gradually hitting a close, and then the full assessment will come. We're gradually inching towards the election year, and it's also another time for Nigerians to rethink and know what sort of agenda and governance they expect. Thank you once again.
I appreciate it, sir.